You're up. Get going. It's running.
That's so. The most memorable vacation to a foreign country.
My most memorable vacation in a foreign country was the first time I went to Europe in 1980. And I went to many places in many countries on that trip, but the most memorable place that I went to was Florence in Italy. I had first heard about Florence when I was a sophomore in college, and I was studying a humanities course. And we used this gigantic 3-inch thick textbook, and we got to the Renaissance and it started talking about Florence, and it was like it went on for pages and pages and pages. It seemed like suddenly the book was about Florence. We looked at amazing works of sculpture and paintings and architecture, and I knew then that someday, soon, I hoped I would go to Florence. When I was a senior, I thought maybe it was going to happen, but the money didn't show up, and the trip had to be postponed for about 9 years, I guess. My first trip was in 1980 when I took a group of students from the high school where I taught. I took them on a trip to Europe, and of course Florence had to be included just to make me happy, but it also was a place that I thought my students needed to see and would love. I had been teaching world literature, and I had already begun talking about the art and the architecture and the culture of the areas we were reading about. When we read Dante's Divine Comedy and we read sonnets by Petrarch, I would talk about the art and the architecture and the culture of Florence, and I would show pictures, and I couldn't wait to go and get my own pictures to show at a later date.
Okay, and so you went to Florence. What was there to see and do once you got there? Were you surprised by anything that you hadn't already known?
I was surprised that it was much bigger and more colorful and more alive. The first time we arrived in Florence, it was early morning, and as we were heading our way to the hotel, we saw all of these vendors hustling through the city with their push carts to set up their outdoor markets near the train station, getting there for the early morning tourists to come and buy things. So the city was quite alive even before the sun had come up. We later went to the street markets, which is one of my favorite things in Florence. There's this big street market near the train station, and then there's a straw market, as it's called, over by the Arno River. And we bought, we shopped, and we ate pizza, and it was a great experience. Later that day, we proceeded to begin the attack on the amazing museums of Florence. Florence is one of the greatest art centers of the world, and there are many great museums. The Uffizi Museum, which is full of some of the great paintings of the Renaissance and other periods. It also has lots of sculpture. And we saved the visit to the Academy, another museum which houses Michelangelo's David. We saved that for the next morning, and that was most amazing. I never realized how large the sculpture was until I stood before it. It's placed in a central location in the museum with a lighted, natural light, daylight coming through the atrium, shining down on it. It's a perfect positioning for this spectacular sculpture, and I had my camera out and I took picture after picture after picture.
And was that legal?
It was legal as long as you didn't use a flash, because I was amazed that there was enough natural daylight in there that you could actually get very good pictures. There are 3 sculptures of David in Florence. One, the 2 copies are outdoors. David originally was supposed to be outdoors in front of the old palace, but many years ago it was moved indoors because the pollution in Florence, which was very bad at the time, was beginning to eat away at the marbles. So a copy now stands outside the palace where the original was, and then high up in the hills overlooking the city is a great piazza, a plaza that's a popular gathering place, and there's a sculpture, a copy of David up there as well.
About the churches in Florence, I know you're a big churchgoer.
I am a churchy.
So, the Duomo is obviously the biggest church in Florence. Did
Yes.
you walk by it?
I did. We went in and walked all around and looked at the gorgeous sculpture, and then we got in the part of the church called the crossing, where the nave and the apse meet each other, and you look up above and you can see the great dome that Brunelleschi designed, which is spectacular both inside and out. When the cathedral was being built, Florence wanted their church to be taller than any other church, just as other cities did, and they had the walls of the building up, and then nobody could seem to figure out how to put a dome over such a large space. No one had done that before, and they began to think that maybe it was going to be impossible, until Brunelleschi came along and figured out a way to do it. We climbed the tower that first visit to Florence. I've never climbed the tower since. I decided that the first time was the best time. I didn't need to do it again. Next to the cathedral is the baptistry. In Florence, there were so many people who wanted to have their children baptized in the cathedral because that was a status that they wanted their children to have. And so they built a freestanding baptistry right across from the cathedral, and it is a spectacular structure as well. And then next to the Duomo is the bell tower designed by Giotto, and it is you can also climb to the top of that. I've never done that. It's a beautiful structure as well. There are lots of other great churches in Florence. It seems like every corner there's another great church to take a look at.
Did you go on any private tours while you were there?
The first trip we didn't have a tour, but I've been there probably a dozen times, and on some other trips we would have a guide, a local guide, who would take us and show us and tell us inside stories about the history of the various structures. One of my favorite places in Florence is the old bridge. It's called the Ponte Vecchio, which means old bridge, and it crosses the Arno River, and the bridge is lined with little shops that are today, then they always, I think they always were, where the gold merchants would display their wares. And the shops are very distinctive because at night they close the shop up and it looks like a trunk with all kinds of iron bars and rivets to protect people from breaking into it. The shopkeepers have a little residence above their shops, and it is a beautiful place to stand. There's an opening at the center of the bridge where you can have a great view up and down both sides of the river. You walk across the bridge, it takes you to a wonderful palace called the Pitti Palace, which was, when it was built, it was considered out of town. Today it's very much part of the city, but this was where the ruling families would go to spend the summer. It was perhaps a little cooler over there, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. That palace has some spectacular gardens that go up a big hill, so that when you get to the top of the garden you can look out and see all of Florence. You can see the clay-tiled roof. All the houses in old Florence are protected by law. They can't be altered, and there can be no building in the old city that doesn't have a clay-tiled roof. So it's quite a view to see all the beautiful tiles and the church towers and so forth.
All right. Let's talk about the food of Florence.
Oh, the food of Florence. The food is spectacular. It doesn't matter whether you're on the run and you stop at a little pizza shop that has pizzas already prepared, and you pick out the one you want, and they take a big slice of it and put it in the super hot ovens and warm it up, and you can stand and eat your pizza, or you can sit down, you can take it away. Some of the best pizzas in those little shops, they call those fast food shops in Florence. You don't get McDonald's, you get wonderful handmade pizza. Florence also has wonderful restaurants for a more serious meal, and every Italian delight you can think of is available. It really doesn't matter where you go to eat in Florence, it's always going to be good. At least my experience has been that.
If you can remember your favorite dish while you were there, perhaps? Or was it too long ago?
Oh, I think I don't have a specific favorite dish. That first trip, I do remember that I had pesto for the first time, but I don't think it was in Florence. That was a little bit north of Florence. But we ate lots of pasta in Florence. The bread is extraordinary. The bread is always fresh, handmade. None of that nasty white bread stuff that we get used to eating. One of my favorite food treats, though, is gelato. And there's a very famous gelato stand in Florence that my friends had told me about and said, "Oh, we have to go to Vivoli's, which supposedly has the best gelato anywhere." So while we were there the first time, we made at least 2 trips to Vivoli's. My favorite was the first time when it was in the evening, and there were just dozens and dozens of people just forced into this little shop, and everyone is trying to get to the counter and make their order. And you make your order by deciding whether you want a cup or a cone, and then you have to pick the size of the cup. They have them on display for ignorant tourists like myself. You can point, and you can get a little baby cup all the way up to the jumbo.
I think that art uncle thing would make a nice title.
Shut up. Please excuse me for saying shut up. And we eventually elbowed our way up to the counter, and I do believe I got one of the largest cups available, just in case I didn't get back. And you get to pick various flavors. You don't just get a cup of chocolate. You can have that if you want, but you can also raise your fingers and say 3, 4, and they will put little gobs of each flavor until the cup is just overflowing. And then they give you a little tiny plastic spoon with which to eat your gelato. And then people go and they hang out in the streets and lean up against the walls and talk and laugh and eat their gelato. Every time I go to Florence, I have to go back to Vivoli's, even though there are many wonderful gelato places. Vivoli's is still very special. I remember the first trip, I bought a little plastic tray that had Vivoli's on it, and I bought a Vivoli's t-shirt. I was going to take away more than just the taste of the ice cream. What other kind of food? I don't know. Another nice thing to do that we did that first year and other years was to decide on a given day we would have a picnic lunch, and it was so much fun going to the various markets. Not American style. You don't go into one store and buy all your food, but you go to the bakery and get your bread that you want to have, and then you go to a market that sells meats, and you order how many slices of prosciutto or salami that you want to have for your picnic, and then you go to a cheese shop and you decide what kind of cheese or cheeses that you'd like to have. And then you go to a fresh produce market and pick up some wonderful Italian tomatoes and maybe some fruit, where the vendors will hand-pick for you. They will ask, do you want to eat it now or do you want to eat it in 2 or 3 days? And if you want to eat it today, they make sure that you get the ripest produce that's available so that it's tasty to eat immediately. And then we find some scenic spot where we can spread out. Oh, I forgot an important part. The wine shop. You must go to the wine shop. How can you have a picnic with all this wonderful Italian food without going to the wine shop? So we get a bottle of wine, then we go to our spot. Sometimes we go up into the gardens at the Pitti Palace, and we find a place in the shade, because it can be very hot in Florence in the summer, and we sit in the shade and look out over the city of Florence and have a wonderful meal. It's one of my favorite meals. You can't go wrong when you go to the stores and pick out your own stuff. That's the picnic.
How long were you in Florence for this trip?
The first time, I think we were just there 5 days. I think we stayed 4 nights and 5 days. And we packed in a lot of museums. We went to the Uffizi and we went to the Academy. We also went to see the tombs that Michelangelo designed for the ruling family of Florence. They were the Medici family, and they were very wealthy, very powerful, and also very civic-minded. They believed that they had a responsibility to put their money to work. And one of the reasons there's so many wonderful works of art and architecture coming out of Florence during the Renaissance was because the Medici would commission artists and architects. They would hire them to design wonderful things, make great paintings, and because of that we have an amazing wealth of art and architecture coming from that period. They were bankers. They made their money in banking and also I believe the woolen industry. Florence was a financial center at the time, and many of its products were famous and have been for hundreds of years. It's a center of great handcrafted leather goods, and certainly gold, and the jewelry that they made with gold. It's also a ceramics center, which is one of my favorites. There's a little shop in Florence right before you cross. No, it's right after you cross over the Ponte Vecchio to the other side of the Arno, and I make it a point every time I go to Florence to go to that little shop and add to my collection of ceramics. Another fun thing to do in Florence is just to wander about. Have no particular destination, just look in the shops, sit at a cafe and have coffee, or stop at a bar and have a beer or a glass of wine, and just soak it all in.
I think that's pretty much it. I think
That's enough? Probably if you go back and play back all the BS that I put on the tape. Do you want me to spell any of those words?
Pity Palace.
It's P-I-T-T-I. I know
That's
that.
close. I think that's it.
The Medici is M-E-D-I-C-I.
Yep.
And I don't know if Uffizi has one F or two Fs. You might look up, you might Google some of those words and check the spelling. You don't want to misspell any of those.
You said you went with students that you were teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Were they seniors or?
They were mostly seniors. Some were underclassmen. It was very much fun to watch their eyes get big when they saw the things that we had actually studied and talked about it. They, my first trip, my eyes were as big as theirs, but subsequent trips was fun as well because I knew exactly how they would react when they saw these great things that they had looked at in books or on slides on the screen. I'm trying to think of some other places in there. Oh, one of my other favorite places is this little chapel. It's called the Pazzi Chapel. It's named after the Pazzi family. God, I don't know about spelling that, Pazzi. I think it's P-A-Z-Z-I. But you better double check that. And it's just a very small little chapel, but it's perfect Renaissance architecture. It's very simple, very symmetrical. But it takes some of the classical elements from ancient Greece and Rome, but it brings it down to a more human scale. One of the things that was going on during the Renaissance in Florence was this new push of humanism. The culture had spent hundreds of years focusing on the religious side of life during the Middle Ages, and suddenly in Florence there was a renewed interest in man, and the paintings began to take on a new look. So instead of just very stylized icons of human beings that had very little expression on their face, didn't really look all that human, suddenly the faces became more rounded, the expressions on the face more natural, and man was back at the center of attention. Not that they lost their religious belief or devotion, but it was as though it was time to take another look at human experience and focus on this world and not just the other world exclusively. the afterworld.
So you'd say this is your most memorable trip because it was your first time?
It was because it was the first time, and then Florence became always one of my favorites. So you never see anything the second time with the same eyes that you did the first time. It's you see new things the second, third, 12th time, but it's that first impression that is so memorable. So the art that I was learning in college, in the textbook, that piqued my interest, suddenly became alive, and then I couldn't get enough of it. I just came back from, I don't know whether it was my 12th visit to Florence or my 15th. I lost count a long time ago, but I just came back 3 or 4 weeks ago from another visit to Florence. And I'm quite sure I'll make another one before I die, or more.
All right.
That's the end of the story.
Thank you.